My husband stood in front of 200 staff members and fired me. He said I was incompetent and a disgrace to the hospital. Everyone clapped, nobody knew the truth. I wasn't just an employee. My name was on every deed, every license, every single paycheck in that building, including his. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to sit with me for a minute. If you're watching this, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. And if stories about strength, betrayal, and quiet power speak to you, hit that follow button now because trust me, you don't want to miss where this one ends up. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand who I was before that day, so you can understand who I became after it. I grew up watching my mother clean hospital floors for a paycheck that barely covered rent. She used to tell me, "One day, baby, you won't be cleaning these halls. You'll be the one deciding who gets to walk them." I didn't understand what she meant back then. I just knew I wanted to make her proud, so I studied. I worked nights while going to school during the day. And through a series of events I still sometimes can't believe, an inheritance from a great uncle I barely knew, smart investments, and a hospital that was failing until I quietly bought controlling shares in it, I became an owner. Not just an investor, the owner. But here's the thing about real power, the kind that lasts, it doesn't need an announcement. I didn't walk into that hospital wearing a crown. I walked in wearing scrubs some days, a blazer other days, and I let the executive team run daily operations while I stayed mostly behind the curtain. Few people knew my full role. I liked it that way. I never wanted people to treat me differently because of what I owned. I wanted to be seen for who I was, not what I had. That's where he came in. I met my husband at a hospital conference 3 years before all of this happened. He was magnetic. Charming in that way that makes a room lean toward him when he speaks. He had big dreams, bold ideas, and an ambition that honestly I found attractive at first. We fell in love fast, maybe too fast. When a position opened up for chief administrator at my hospital, I recommended him, not because he was my husband, but because on paper he was qualified. What I didn't realize was that by giving him that position, I was handing him a stage. And he loved being on stage. At first, things were good. We were the power couple of the hospital, at least in whispers. I never used my ownership to interfere with daily operations. I trusted the board, I trusted the systems we built, and most of all, I trusted him. I stayed in my role as a senior operations director, a job I'd actually built from the ground up years earlier, long before I ever had real ownership. It let me stay close to the work I loved: patient care, staff well-being, keeping the heart of the hospital beating. But somewhere in that first year, something shifted in him. Maybe it was always there and I just didn't want to see it. He started taking credit for ideas that weren't his. In meetings, he'd repeat suggestions I made privately to him the night before, presenting them as his own genius. I let it go. I told myself, we're a team, what's mine is his. But a team doesn't erase one half of itself. A team doesn't make one person invisible so the other can shine. Then came the small embarrassments. He'd correct me in front of colleagues over things that didn't need correcting. He'd sigh when I spoke in meetings, like I was taking up space he was entitled to. He'd introduce me to important guests as my wife who helps out around here, like I was a volunteer instead of the reason the hospital existed in its current form at all. I stayed quiet, not because I was weak. Because I loved him, and because pride is a strange thing. It convinces you that protecting someone else's ego is the same thing as protecting your marriage. Around the same time, I started noticing other things. Numbers that didn't add up in departmental budgets he oversaw. Vendor contracts signed without board approval. A young staff member he'd hired personally, someone with little experience but a lot of late nights spent reviewing reports with him behind closed doors. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself I was tired, overworked, paranoid, but my gut kept whispering what my mind didn't want to admit. One night I stayed late reviewing quarterly reports, and I found an email thread I wasn't supposed to see. It wasn't romantic, not exactly, but it was intimate in the way two people become when they're building a secret world together. Compliments that had nothing to do with work, jokes only insiders would understand. And worse, financial approvals that bypassed proper channels. Money moved in ways that should have required my signature, not his alone. I didn't confront him right away. I know some of you are yelling at the screen right now, telling me I should have, but I needed proof. I needed to understand the full shape of what was happening before I said a single word, so I watched, I documented. I stayed calm on the outside while my heart quietly broke on the inside, and then came the day that changed everything. It started like any other Tuesday. There was an all-staff meeting scheduled, routine, quarterly updates, nothing unusual. I walked into that auditorium the same way I always did, blending into the crowd, sitting somewhere in the middle rows instead of up front where executives usually sat. That was my way. I never wanted special treatment. My husband stood at the podium looking sharper than usual, more confident, like a man about to deliver a speech he'd rehearsed in the mirror. He started with the usual updates of patient satisfaction scores, upcoming renovations, new hires, and then, without warning, his tone shifted. He said there had been concerns about performance in the operations department. He said there needed to be accountability at every level, no exceptions. And then he looked directly at me in front of 200 people and he said my name. He said I had been underperforming. He said my leadership style was outdated and resistant to necessary change. He said, and I will never forget these exact words, that I had become a liability the hospital could no longer afford to carry. The room went silent, then it didn't. Some people gasped. A few, the ones who'd always been a little jealous, a little threatened by how effortlessly I moved through that building, they actually clapped. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to make the humiliation complete. He told me in front of everyone that effective immediately, I was terminated. I want to tell you what was going through my mind in that moment because it wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't rage, it wasn't even heartbreak, not yet, it was clarity. Sharp, cold clarity. Because in that instant, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself accept until then. This man standing at that podium didn't know me at all. He knew a version of me I had allowed him to see. Humble, quiet, easy to underestimate. He had no idea that the woman he just fired owned the building he was standing in. He didn't know that his own paycheck existed because of a signature I had made years before we ever met. I didn't argue. I didn't cry, not there. I stood up slowly, smoothed down my blazer, and I looked at him with a calm that I could tell unsettled him more than any shouting match ever could. Then I turned, and I walked out of that auditorium without saying a single word. The walk to my car felt like it took an hour. Every step, I could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes that had just watched my husband strip away my dignity in public. Some of you might think I broke down the second I got in my car. And yes, eventually I did cry, but not out of weakness. I cried because a marriage I had given everything to had just ended in the cruelest, most public way possible. I cried because the man I loved had shown me finally, without disguise, exactly who he was. But grief doesn't stay in one place forever. By the next morning, something else had replaced it. Not anger exactly. Resolve. I called my lawyer that same night. Not for divorce papers, not yet, for something else entirely. I needed him to prepare documents. Real ones, ownership transfer notices, executive authority reinstatement. A formal, undeniable declaration of who actually held the deed to that hospital, whose name was on the licenses, whose signature made every single paycheck in that building possible. 2 days later, the hospital received an official notice, not from HR, not from the board secretary. From my legal team, informing every department head that there would be an emergency meeting called by the majority shareholder and full owner of the hospital. You should have seen how fast that message traveled. I heard later that people were terrified, whispering in hallways, trying to figure out who this mysterious owner was that none of them had ever met in person. Meanwhile, my husband, the man who fired me 48 hours earlier, received a call from the board chairman asking him to explain why he had just terminated the person who legally controlled the entire institution. I wasn't there for that call, but I heard about the silence on his end. I heard about how his voice cracked when he asked, "Wait, what do you mean my wife owns this hospital?" That's the moment his world tilted, because up until then he thought he understood the shape of our marriage, our careers, our power dynamic. He thought he was the ambitious one, the rising star, and I was simply along for the ride, supporting his career from somewhere comfortably behind him. He had no idea that the entire structure he stood on had been built, quite literally, by me. He called me 11 times that day. I didn't answer a single one, not out of cruelty. I just needed silence. I needed space to process what our marriage had actually been, stripped of all its illusions. When I finally did walk back into that hospital, it wasn't as an employee returning to beg for her job back. It was as the owner, arriving to address her staff directly for the first time in years. I remember the way the room changed when I walked in. The same auditorium where I'd been humiliated now felt different under my feet. People who had clapped when I was fired now sat frozen, unsure whether to look at me or look away. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply stood at that same podium and told them the truth. I told them who I was. I told them how long I had owned this institution and why I had chosen until now to lead quietly rather than loudly. I told them that leadership isn't about who commands the most attention in a room. It's about who shows up day after day doing the work, even when nobody claps for it. Then I addressed my husband directly in front of the same staff who had witnessed my humiliation days before. I didn't scream. I didn't call him names. I simply informed him calmly that his position as chief administrator was terminated, effective immediately, due to unauthorized financial transactions and conduct unbecoming of a hospital leader. I told him his access to every system, every account, every office in that building was already revoked before I even walked through the door that morning. I watched him try to speak. I watched him search for the same confidence he'd worn like armor just 2 days before, and I watched it crumble because he realized, in that moment, there was nothing he could say that would change what was coming. Later that day, in private, he tried a different approach. He apologized. He said he didn't know what came over him, that ambition had clouded his judgment, that he still loved me and wanted to fix things. But love isn't something you get to demand back after you've publicly dismantled someone's dignity to elevate your own image. I told him calmly that some things can't be undone with an apology. I told him that the version of him I fell in love with either never truly existed or had been buried so deep under his own ego that it no longer mattered which one was true. I filed for divorce 2 weeks later, not out of spite, out of self-respect. In the months that followed, I rebuilt, not just the leadership structure of the hospital but myself. I brought in new department heads who valued transparency and integrity. I created systems where no single person, no matter how charming or ambitious, could ever manipulate finances or intimidate staff into silence again. I made sure that the culture of that hospital reflected what my mother always dreamed it could be, a place where people were valued for their work, not their proximity to power. And I learned something about myself through all of this, something I want to leave you with tonight. For years, I made myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. I stayed quiet through disrespect because I confused humility with self-erasure. I let ambition disguised as love convince me that my worth needed his validation to be real, but worth was never his to give. It was mine all along, just like that hospital. The version of me who walked out of that auditorium in silence, the woman who let 200 people watch her get humiliated without saying a word, she wasn't weak. She was patient. She understood something that ego never will, that real power doesn't need to announce itself. It simply waits for the truth to come out on its own timing. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story tonight, let it be this. Never let anyone convince you that your quiet strength is weakness. Never shrink yourself just to protect someone else's fragile pride. And never forget your own worth, even when the people closest to you seem to have forgotten it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength or maybe your own healing, I want you to comment below and tell me, what would you have done in my position? Would you have confronted him right there in that room, or would you have waited like I did for the truth to reveal itself? And if stories like this speak to your soul, make sure you follow this channel because there are more stories coming. Stories about strength, betrayal, quiet power, and the women who rise after everything tries to break them. Thank you for walking through this story with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.